we're going to get started. So thank you to those of you who are joining us here in person, and thank you to those of us who have joined us online. I'm Melissa Barnett. I'm the director of the Francis McClelland Institute for Children, Youth, and Families, or FMI, as we call ourselves. And I'm so glad you could join us for our first Turbeville speaker series of the year. Before we get to the reason you are here today, I want to tell you a little bit about FMI. First of all, I'll tell you about our upcoming events. So our next Turbeville speaker series is on October 11th. We have our Vision Awards on the 24th, and then we have the third Turbeville talk on Friday, November 8th. So we hope that you come back to join us. I also, although many of you are online, for those of us who are here in Tucson, I do want to start by acknowledging, reading the official land acknowledgement of the University of Arizona, which importantly was developed in partnership with tribal leaders. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the A'atham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. So, if you haven't been at any of our events before, welcome. We hope you keep coming. For those of you who know about us, you could probably do this part of the presentation for me. But here at the Francis McClelland Institute, our goal is to use the power of research to work collaboratively to build family resilience so that children, youth, and families, especially those experiencing disadvantage and marginalization, are able to thrive. We do this by supporting innovative research, actively partnering with community organizations, sharing research findings with practitioners and the community, and educating the next generation of engaged scholars and leaders. All of the work that we do is in honor of the legacy of Francis McClelland, who was a U of A alum, a business leader, and very generous philanthropist who really lived a life that facilitated, exemplified, and supported resilience. We are also pleased to honor and to say thank you to Pamela Turbeville, an alum of the Norton School, who has continued to be involved and supportive in important ways across the years. Finally, the reason you're here is I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Melanie Bertrand. Dr. Bertrand is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies and Practice at the University of Arizona. And importantly, she is also a former K-5 teacher. Her research explores the potential of youth and community leadership to improve schools and challenge systemic racism and other forms of oppression in education. Her work pushes the educational leadership field to include youth, especially youth of color and other youth facing injustice, in expanded conceptions of leadership. And I will say before we turn it over, Dr. Bertrand has said if you have a sort of burning question along the way, again, you're in the room, she's happy to answer that question. We will save time at the end for questions. If you're online, you can put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and I will be monitoring that. So now I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Bertrand. Change seats.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and thank you so much for the amazing introduction, Dr. Barnett. My name is Melanie Bertrand, and as you just heard, I'm an associate professor in the College of Education. My pronouns are she and hers, and I'm just very pleased to be here as part of the Turbeville Speaker Series and also as hosted by the Francis McClelland Institute for Children, Youth, and Families. And we just had the land acknowledgement. Thank you so much, Dr. Barnett. We are all on indigenous lands, whether we're here at the University of Arizona campus, main campus, or whether we're anywhere else in the United States or beyond. And I want to point out, as Dr. Barnett said, we're here on the lands of the Tohono O'odham and also the Yaqui people. And so a land acknowledgement doesn't necessarily rectify current and past injustices, but it serves as a reminder for me and maybe some of those who are listening to take action when we need to take action. I'm going to go ahead and start. Is from the the Tempe Union High School student or district in the other area of the state, the other big metropolitan area of the state. This district holds a superintendent's student advisory council. And I want to just read a quote from their website here. Each school year, the Tempe Union High School district superintendent convenes a superintendent's student advisory council. These student leaders serve as representatives for each of TUHSD's 7 high schools. They are recommended by school administrators. The students must be in good standing academically. The council members ask questions, share ideas, and discuss issues that come up from their campuses. And then they work collaboratively to provide solutions. And so I wanted to ask all of you who are here in the room or even online. Okay. What are your thoughts about the video and the website text? So if you could just take a moment to either reflect individually or chat with somebody who's nearby. If you're online, maybe you don't have a person nearby, but either way, whether you're in person or online, if you could just take a couple minutes and either reflect on these or chat with somebody who's nearby you.
By website text, are you talking about the quote that you just read?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Would you mind enlarging that and showing us that quote again?
Yes. Great.
Maybe clicking on slideshow so we see the slideshow in the full screen.
Yeah, see, we're seeing it on the webinar, but
Oh,
yeah.
strange. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Oh,
whereas,
okay.
like,
Oh, interesting.
although
Okay.
now it stopped sharing to the webinar.
I see.
sorry to break.
Oh, no.
Is it
I
Canvas?
hadn't realized that. That's good to
Google
know.
Slides.
Okay.
You want to see that, and then is it on Canva that way?
Google
Nope.
Slides.
PowerPoint? Oh, there we go. Oh, beautiful.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. So yeah, just take a few minutes and then we'll reconvene maybe 3-4 minutes.
Sorry, can you click OK to the top?
Mm-hmm.
So then we remove that and then move the people. Oh, yeah,
Oh.
that part, exactly, you were just there, and move it down. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. There we go.
Very much appreciate.
Yeah, no problem.
So we have a comment from someone in the chat. Would you like me to share that?
There we go.
Sure.
So,
Oh, actually, let's have a few minutes of discussion and then we can bring that in. Thank you. Oh.
we can do that later.
Oh, I see.
Hi, Norma. Nice to meet you.
I don't know. We didn't.
My thoughts is
The
that
audio was coming out.
tokenized because
I see. It didn't go
go
through them.
through and filter the
I see.
these situations, and even then, they don't really have agency.
Right, like, I mean, the fact that they are not voting members, is a big issue. Like, if we hear your voice and you still don't get to vote, people can ignore it. And yes, you're right, that they're recommended, by some administrators, so there is this filter of they choose who they wanna have, so. Some kind of like vote or something to that effect, or self-nominating. So,
So the overall impact.
Thank you so much for reflecting and chatting with whoever's nearby you. I appreciate it. Maybe we could talk about something that came up in your conversation. I saw a really passionate conversation back here. Anything that came up in your conversation there?
Well, we talked about a few things Adam had sequenced. What we were saying at the end was it's tricky. We were talking about some committees here that we have that have student representatives on them. And it can be hard when that one student has to speak for a large group of students. That can be a lot to put on a student sometimes.
Thank you.
And I was also saying, so I'm the current chair for our undergraduate program committee, but we don't actually have an undergraduate student on that committee
I see,
to represent
yeah.
the experience of the students themselves.
And these are structural issues, you know, not related to any individual blame, but yeah, structural issues. Yeah. What else came up from these conversations that you had?
I saw the students as being prompts
Okay.
to kind of represent an idea that they should be included, but the impact of their inclusion is very minimal because they have to first go through this crazy pathway of getting adult approval to even sit in a space like that. And then when they are there, they don't even have a lot of power. They have an advisory vote, so it's more props for the adults, it seems like.
Oh, okay. Props. Anything else in the room?
And if they're selected by school administrators who have to have good academic standing, they're these ideal students that probably represent the population of students.
Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, so the
Yes.
online comments are actually very much echo what people just said in the room. So I think
Okay.
we could probably move on.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks to those online who
Yeah.
included comments in there. Appreciate it. And thank you all for sharing. So what are some of the reasons or motivations why schools, districts, and organizations have youth voice initiatives? And so we talked, some of these came up just now, which I'll have in the fourth bullet point. But the first three bullet points are related to development, youth development, are some of the motivations for some of these types of youth voice initiatives. So academic benefits, research shows all this list actually. Critical consciousness development, also called socio-political development, civic agency, leadership development, good PR for the school or the district or the organization, like we heard right here, props, right? It's related to that point. And also to guide and inform policy decisions. And so I would say that the first three are very important. And I refer to and read research about those first three frequently. That's not exactly my area of research, though. These are the citations for this research behind these things. My area, though, is this last bullet point here. I'm very interested in youth guiding and informing policy decisions for pragmatic reasons, because it can improve the policies themselves. And so overall, I want to impart today that youth-facing injustices, youth in general, but specifically youth-facing injustices, hold insights about the conditions that they experience in their schools. And they may have creative solutions for those experiences and those injustices they face in their schools. And that's why I have an interest in it, and that's why I pursue it in my research. Who am I talking about when I say youth-facing injustices? I'm talking about students of color in general, and/or queer students, transgender students, students with disabilities, multilingual students labeled as English language learners, undocumented students, students who are members of minoritized religions, and also working class students. And what are the injustices that I'm talking about when I say facing injustices? I'm talking about racism and white supremacy. I'm talking structurally here. Yes, interpersonal is obviously, and microaggressions and macroaggressions are obviously very harmful. But I'm talking here about the structural, institutional manifestations of racism and white supremacy. Anti-LGBTQ discrimination. Actually, this whole list is structural. Ableism, linguistic discrimination, nativism related to anti-immigrant discrimination, religious discrimination, wealth inequity, and adultism. Adultism is something that all youth face, actually. And you'll see some citations about these various forms of injustices at the bottom of the page there. I want to be a little more specific about what the injustices are, the actual concrete effects. Inequity in educational resources, often by social class and race, by school, and by district. Exclusion from sports teams, students being excluded from sports teams matching their gender. That's the law in this state. Exclusion from quality curriculum and also social spheres. A lot of times students with disabilities and multilingual students labeled as English learners are excluded from quality curriculum. Tracking into remedial classes. Over-disciplining, exclusion from bilingual education. Many of you probably know laws here in Arizona related to that. And also there's those interpersonal forms of discrimination. I want to point out the ways that when we include students who are facing these injustices, when we center their voices and their thoughts and their perspectives in forming policy, what can happen? You can see that a lot in activism. For instance, most recently in around 2020, 2021, Black Lives Matter, youth Black Lives Matter activists were key and crucial to pushing school districts to divest from school policing, which actually, and we have a siren that just
Right on cue.
goodness, to divest from school policing and allocate the funding towards students, back to students. I'm not going to talk about activism though here because I'm talking about formal ways that youth are incorporated in decision making or quasi-formal. And so I have a list here of different research about initiatives, youth voice initiatives that led to equity-oriented policy change, like improved equity in school discipline, addressing racism in the enforcement of dress codes, increased access to healthy foods, and expanded access to multicultural curricula. And now I want to turn to my own research, but before doing that, I wanted to talk about my positionality. So unlike youth-facing injustices, I have a lot of privilege. And as you see here, I'm a white person. That means in this society structured by white supremacy, I'm benefiting from the same structure that harms people and youth of color. And also there are other axes of privilege that I have, such as being middle class, cisgender, I have US citizenship, I'm a tenured professor, straight, and an adult. So all of these are part of my positionality. I'm also a woman. And these positionalities do influence my research. All research has some type of a bias and is influenced in some way by positionality, even statistical research, although this is qualitative. But what I want to say here is that it informed, not informed, but it influenced my research on all phases. For instance, my positionality inhibited my connections with youth in my study. It also shaped how I was thinking about the analysis. But the good news that I want to share is that I work with research teams that help balance these perspectives in the analysis and in the whole process. The research that I'm not going to talk about, but was a precursor, was a youth participatory action research project at a K-8 school. And youth participatory action research is youth-driven research about a local manifestation of a social justice issue. And myself and some colleagues started an after-school program at this school for middle school students in around 2015, and we ran it for 2.5 years. We also collected data on it. Dr. E. Sybil Durand and Dr. Tausia Gonzalez and I are the ones who started and implemented this program. And Dr. Don Demps and Dr. Sara Salinas were integral to analyzing data along with myself and the other 2 colleagues. And this study led me to wonder what would happen, or what does happen in a school where these types of youth voice initiatives are central to the school itself, rather than brought in by outside researchers. And so I set out to try to find such a school. And I found it in a school called, and there are many, but I was lucky enough to be introduced to the principal in this school, which I'm calling Sandoval School. By the way, all of these are pseudonyms. And so there are plenty of youth initiatives at Sandoval K-12 school, and none of them were started by outside researchers. And collaborators here at, not just at the school, but with this study, were Taina Ferrari de Olindo, Dr. Leda W. Garcia, and Dr. Ashley D. Dominguez. And at the school, I want to tell you a little bit about the school itself. It was in a western state in the US. The administrators, all of the administrators during the study period were Latine or Asian American. The teachers at the school were Asian American Pacific Islander were 25%, 2% Black teachers, 1% Filipino teachers, 48% Latine teachers, and 20% white teachers. And the students, I'm particularly talking about the middle and high school students at the school. Those students were 8% Asian American Pacific Islander, 2% Black, 4% Filipino, 85% Latine, 1% white, 14% students with disabilities, and 16% multilingual students labeled as English language learners. Of course, there's some overlap with those last two categories, overlap with the rest of the categories. And I want to also tell you about some of the initiatives that this school had that were there and alive and well and thriving rather when we started the research. So there were a lot of clubs that actively, for instance, conducted surveys, presented research, presented policies to change the school. There were grade level councils, so they didn't have the average student council. There were no elections. Instead, it was anyone who wanted to be on this council could be on this council. There was no numerical cap to the number, and anyone could be on it. And there were no elections, like I said. There was a student-led class, a class that students could take that was actually led by 9 students. And there were often surveys of students, either generated by these clubs or generated by teachers or administrators, a lot, that were meant to inform policies. And then I want to mention or highlight 2 other areas, the Student Advisory Board, SAB, and the Governance Council, or GC. These were 2 of the top areas where students had a direct or could have a direct influence on policy at the school. The Student Advisory Board was with the principal herself. And then the Governance Council was a state mandated and also district mandated governing body of the school. It was mandated by the state to include students, but this school included a lot more than it had to. So a lot more students than required. We collected data in 2020, 2021. That school year was entirely online. In 21, 22, also we collected data. There were 23 youth participants, 16 adult participants. We did 48 total interviews. You can see from the math here that sometimes we interviewed someone more than once. We had 36 observations and field notes, and also 70 artifacts rather. I want to point out about the interviews. One important question from the interviews is that we asked, so do all students, are all students in these leadership spaces, or is it just a few students, or is it just some types of students? We asked that question of everybody, youth and adults. We didn't say, is this group represented? We didn't mention any particular group. We just opened it up and we saw what happened, saw what they would mention. And so, yes.
What are artifacts?
Oh, yes, great question, thank you. So artifacts in this case refer to a lot of digital things because of that first year being so online. So artifacts were sometimes screenshots, meeting agendas digitally. They were student-produced items like slides that students would produce for faculty meetings, for example. Especially from the Student Advisory Board, there were a lot of artifacts because I was also a participant in there, although it was not facilitated by me. And so there were artifacts that were produced by students, but also artifacts from the school and the district. A lot related to COVID, as you can imagine, during that time. And almost no physical artifacts, except for in the second year, because it was so online. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. So that's a great question before turning to the findings. The major findings are these, that the roadblocks to youth shaping policies at Sandoval School were tokenization or tokenism of youth voice, and also underrepresentation of youth-facing injustices. I want to quickly say that the real dictionary word is tokenism, but I'm using tokenization to point to the process that's involved in this, to point to those actions and processes. And underrepresentation of youth-facing injustices is the second area. So in terms of tokenization, let's start with that one. The definition that I use here in this particular talk is youth inclusion in decision-making at a purely symbolic level. And interestingly, one of the prime spaces that this happened at Sandoval, and we did not see it very often, actually, but one of the prime spaces was the Governance Council. In other words, that space that was really at the pinnacle of where youth could have had an influence. But this is where they were the most tokenized. And you can see this in an article coming out with first author Taina Ferrari de Olindo, coming out in November. And so I just do want to point out a little bit about the tokenization. So one of the Governance Council members was Ophelia. She was a 12th grader in 2020, 2021. And she was seeing this tokenization when she was a member. So I'll just read this quote. In the Government Council, we give them help in making decisions. But I feel like sometimes our votes aren't enough sometimes. We're not told 100% of all the time what's happening in our school. Sometimes it's even hard to understand the language on some of the things that are being made for our school. So we're told about them, but sometimes it's like in a different, more complicated language. We sometimes need it to be broken down. Yeah, I think sometimes we're not given that space to vote as much as we should. So here you can see that Ophelia doesn't feel like, even though she's voting, it doesn't mean much, you know? It's not making an impact, because when she says we, she's talking about other student members. She's saying that the student members don't even really understand everything that they're seeing. And that's coming up in the Governance Council. And Fernando, who was an 11th grader in 2020, 2021, agreed in a separate interview. Right before this quote, he was asked, you know, are you okay with the level of responsibility you have, or would you want more responsibility? So that's what he was asked right before this quote. When he's talking about Ms. Vasquez, he's talking about an administrator. And he says, no, I would definitely want to do more. Actually, I was talking to Ms. Vasquez and I was telling her, I was like, no, you guys talk about the budget, bring up lots of data, and we just sit there and we say yes to everything. To approve any motions, to say no, or, well, no one really says no. Everyone says yes. But I mean, we don't really do much. So you can see with this quote that he's basically saying that the student members of the Governance Council were essentially figureheads. And what's interesting is that the student members of the Governance Council held the top spots, held the chairperson spot, the vice chairperson spot, the secretary spot, and the parliamentarian spot, all required by various rules and laws. But essentially, they were figureheads. But the school did address tokenization in the Governance Council, and this was prompted by Fernando and other students. He went to administrators and said, hey, why don't you do briefings for us before each meeting? Can you please just explain what's on this agenda? And to second what he said, I sat in on a lot of these Governance Council meetings, and I was super confused. Anyone who's not in the district as an administrator or teacher and doesn't know all the acronyms and the budget technicalities, it's super complex. And so he rightly suggested, getting some background about that before the meeting starts. And Ms. Vasquez took up that request, and she started doing that by the following school year. So in spring of the following school year, which was spring of '22, she said this: I think it's what I realized with the students is I need to prepare them to enter into these formal, mostly adult spaces with preparing them, telling them, this is the agenda, what's your opinion? Can you engage in that space? And then prompting them in the meeting, what do people think? What do you think? And I'll write in the chat, you should say what you wanted to say. By chat, she's talking about the Zoom chat. The meetings were on Zoom. And so you can see here a little bit of the complexity, because it's clear that Ms. Vasquez had not intended to tokenize youth in the space. And I honestly, from the other interviews with administrators, I don't think anyone had intended it. And by having these pre-meetings, it did add to her busy schedule. Administrators are super busy people. And she wanted to do this. She wanted to more authentically include youth in leadership. So in other words, sometimes tokenization happens without the intention behind it. It happens related to these structures. And then the intention here was to dismantle it. So there had to be effort to dismantle, or it wasn't dismantled entirely, right? But it was addressed and it was diminished. I want to now move on to underrepresentation. So the definition used in this talk today is youth voice initiative membership that's not proportionately reflecting students facing injustices in a school or district. And I would add, facing multiple injustices in a school or district is also important to consider. And I also, before we talk about underrepresentation, I want to mention that we did not test for statistical significance of underrepresentation. And so I'm going to be mentioning the degree of evidence for each of these areas, with the last one having the most evidence, which I think could definitely be statistically significant. Okay, so first, along the lines of societal power dynamics is what we saw in terms of underrepresentation. Power dynamics related to Blackness, disability, and language. So in other words, Black students appeared to be underrepresented, or the potential to be underrepresented. Students with disabilities were underrepresented, and multilingual students who were labeled as English language learners were underrepresented. And then there were schooling structures. There were grades and test scores, and then federally mandated services, such as services for students with disabilities and services for students labeled as English language learners. And so these two structures are basically structures that shaped the previous stack there, the societal power dynamics, and vice versa. So in other words, students who were getting lower grades were underrepresented in leadership. Students who were receiving mandated services were underrepresented in leadership. So you could say, you're thinking, well, aren't you saying the same thing as you just said? And yes, kind of. But here I'm trying to focus on the schooling structures. And so now moving to the barriers that Black students faced that affected their participation in leadership roles, or may have affected. So Tabari was a 9th grader in the 2021-22 school year, and he mentioned that the Black Student Union, which had just recently been formed, was a safe space for Black students on campus. And so he didn't mention that the campus was unsafe, or the school was unsafe for Black students. However, by saying that the Black Student Union created a safe space for everyone, it suggests that there was a need for such a space. Also, 2 teachers mentioned that there was an anti-Black school climate. For instance, Ms. Can said, and as Black students speak up about things that are not working, or calling out staff on their anti-Blackness, or ways that our school perpetuates anti-Blackness, are people actually listening and willing to do something about it? And so Ms. Cans and also this other teacher used the term anti-Blackness. And another teacher mentioned the percent of Black students in the school. As you may remember, this was a pretty low percentage. And Ms. Simmons said that this could affect a Black student's participation in leadership roles. Ms. Simmons said, I mean, I'm an adult, and it's daunting being in a room where you're the only Black person. And as a student, just physically looking at your audience, do you want to do that? And so these are some of the ways, these are some quotes and evidence that suggest that Black students faced barriers to participating in leadership roles. And indeed, during the study period, there were no Black students in the Student Advisory Board or the Governance Council. Again, this in particular, because of the percentage of Black students, is very hard to argue about underrepresentation because of the numbers. However, I think it's easy to argue that there were barriers that may have faced Black students' participation in leadership roles. Now I want to move on to disability. This diagram shows that students with disabilities did appear to be underrepresented in leadership roles. And in addition, this was influenced by the mandated services and the grades and test scores, like I was mentioning earlier. So in the beginning I mentioned, or when I mentioned about the demographics of the school, 14% of Sandoval middle schoolers and high schoolers have a disability. And I want to point out here that just one member of the Student Advisory Board and and 0 members of the the Governance Council had a disability. And so, that was in total, those two combined were about 12 students. And so if you did a little bit of math, you could see it's possible that there was some numerical or statistically significant underrepresentation, but I didn't run the numbers as I mentioned.
Good question.
Yeah.
This category of students with disabilities, does that include physical disabilities as well as learning disabilities?
Yes, and intellectual disabilities as well. Thank you. Yes. Thanks for that question. So 4 school adults mentioned that students with disabilities were underrepresented on campus. One of these was Ms. D'Angelo, who said, and our special ed population too. I mean, although we try to encourage their voices all over, I just think I would love to hear more of it. And this is going to get more to your question that you had just now. The school used an inclusion model. They described it as an inclusion model. Sometimes students were pulled out for services, taken to various rooms, to the special education teachers. But there was also one self-contained classroom that wasn't, where these students weren't included in the rest of the classes. There was one participant who mentioned this, and this was Enrique, a 10th grader in 2020-2021. And he said, so something I've noticed throughout the years is that special ed students get their own classroom, so they don't really interact with other students. So this doesn't prove that this is related to the underrepresentation, but it suggests that this separation and also a hierarchy, right, was related to perhaps students with disabilities not signing up for leadership opportunities. And I want to mention now grades and test scores. So 1 student and 12 adults, so 13 people, which is quite a lot, said that high achievers are the ones who are in these leadership positions in school. High academic achievers, that is. Ms. Delcide said, it's mostly students who are academically successful. Oftentimes, it's a lot of similar students that are kind of doing a lot of the leadership roles. And more to your point, I want to point out the district's definitions of disability. This is the district that houses Sandoval School, and these definitions are the same as the state in which this district was housed. So the district defined learning disability as a gap between a student's achievement, quote, and, quote, intellectual ability, and defined intellectual ability, and defined intellectual disability as a student or being held by a student who has significantly below average general intellectual functioning, which adversely affects the pupil's educational performance. So you can see academics are part of the very definition of disability that the district and the state is using. So that means that lower academic grades are overdetermined for students who have a learning disability or an intellectual disability. And students with learning disabilities were the majority of students at the school who had disabilities. And so that means that grades and test scores were also a barrier in this complex intersecting way, or a barrier to students with disabilities being in these leadership roles. Let's go to language now. So, as with disability, multilingual students labeled as English language learners appeared to be underrepresented, as also, again, related to mandated services and grades and test scores. So those bottom two are school structures. I want to also point out that language could be considered a school structure, is a school structure. Schools are structured by the use of English language, and that was in most of the United States. And that was certainly the case at this school, even though the school very much was interested in bilingualism and multilingualism. The school's governance council meetings, for example, had a translator always, translating in Spanish and sometimes into Korean. And also the administrators were bilingual in one of two languages, or even multilingual, actually. And so bilingualism and multilingualism were very much appreciated at the school, yet there were spaces where, for instance, teacher meetings, faculty meetings that were almost entirely in English, or truly entirely in English. And so there wasn't a lot of multilingualism in some of the spaces, and of course in a lot of the academic spaces. So as you may recall, 16% of students in middle school and high school at Sandoval were labeled as English language learners. And nobody on the Student Advisory Board or the Governance Council was at that time was currently labeled as an English language learner. Some students had been when they were a younger child, an elementary child, but nobody on there was currently labeled as an English language learner. And when you think about numbers, it's pretty obvious here that there was underrepresentation of multilingual students labeled as English language learners. One student of 5 adults mentioned this. One of the adults was Ms. Kim, who mentioned this. And Ms. Kim said, if a student's going to come to our PD, professional development, in other words, the teacher faculty meetings, oftentimes our PDs are in English. So if they were only Spanish dominant, they may not necessarily feel as able to participate in that space. And she mentions these PDs or faculty meetings because a lot of times student leaders would come present their research or their policy recommendations in those spaces. And so that's why she's specifically mentioning this space as potentially barring or discouraging some students from participating in leadership roles. In terms of mandated services, school, these are federally mandated services for English language acquisition. So the school had English language development classes and also had elective English language development. So they had mandated ones for students, and students could also take these elective English language development classes if they wanted to try to pass the state English exam faster. So a couple teachers mentioned that student friend groups might be an issue here. So Ms. Ahmed said, so the newcomer population, yeah, I would say that sometimes those not having their friends in those spaces, that always matters a lot to them if they have friends in those spaces. By newcomer population, she's talking about newcomers to the United States. And so these would be students who are in those ELD or English language development classes. And by those spaces, she's talking about leadership spaces. And so here you can see the separation, but also you can see the hierarchy. It's not just a separation, but you can see that multilingual students who are labeled as English language learners are just not part of these spaces at all. And there was complete separation. In fact, another teacher mentioned that the student representatives, and this gets to a point mentioned when we were chatting earlier, that one of the student representatives might not be able to represent students labeled as English language learners very well because they are not. that population. And I want to have a quote right now from Sitlali, an 11th grader who in 21-22. She mentioned this, which goes to the mandated services as well, but not so much about the friend groups, but about the actual classes and their timing and what they're interfering with. She said, I'm going to read the English translation. But something that, yes, I've noticed is that there are some students who maybe don't receive the same opportunity. For example, when I was part of ELD, my elective was one of the ELD classes, so I couldn't be part of another class. To pass the state English exam, I couldn't do it. So in other words, Sitlali had to forego being in an elective, specifically an elective that offered leadership opportunities in order to take this extra language class, so that she could pass the English test faster. Take a little swig of water. Okay. I'm going to go back now to the grades and test scores. So no need to revisit this quote from Ms. Del Cid. Again, like I said, high achievers were overrepresented amongst the school leaders. But how is this related to English language learners, students labeled that way? So let's now look at the district's definition of an English language learner. They defined that students as those who have not yet developed a proficiency in English that is, quote, sufficient for participation in the regular school program. So it doesn't exactly refer to academics, but it hints at it, you know? And so in this way, you could argue, or I argue, that again, students, multilingual students labeled as English language learners, it was overdetermined. Their grades were overdetermined in terms of having low grades. And again, that would be a barrier to participation. That's another barrier. So that's another barrier that would be related to this student group. I do want to say what the school did to address underrepresentation, both students and adults. So a lot of students took some informal actions, informal like individual actions, such as in the student grade level councils. A lot of times I noticed, and also students reported in interviews, that they would encourage students who weren't speaking a lot to, oh, hey, so-and-so, do you want to say what you were talking about? You know, trying to encourage students who weren't speaking up to share their thoughts. So there was a lot of that going on. Students launched the Muslim Students Association. I didn't talk about religion in this presentation, but this shows the willingness of students to stand up and create a space. I'm assuming that Muslim students may have been underrepresented in leadership. I didn't study that, but that could be the case. And students created this association in which Muslim students could be in more leadership roles. Three adults launched the Black Student Union in about 2020. Also, adults intentionally invited newcomer students who, like I said, were 100% labeled as English language learners, and also students with disabilities to leadership opportunities. And that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't work. And also, oh yes.
I had a quick question. I was thinking about this because
Yeah.
the first year was like 2020, right? So
Yes.
did they talk about like how the meetings and communication
Yeah.
functioned that year versus like how it transitioned? I'm assuming more of it was like on Zoom or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from the first year to the second year.
Yeah.
Well, the first year was entirely on Zoom, and so then it came to be more hybrid in the second year. So interestingly, a lot of the meetings stayed on Zoom. A lot of the kind of extracurricular type, the classroom-based leadership opportunities were in person, but for instance, the governance council stayed online, and it is to this day. And some other clubs sometimes met in person, sometimes via Zoom, or sometimes both. And so it was pretty interesting. And I'm thinking about what was the impact of Zoom, and I haven't fully figured that out yet.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, like how it could have been helpful and not helpful for like communication and stuff like that. We were talking about that in my adolescence class yesterday about like how it was beneficial and not beneficial because it closes people out, brings people in, that kind of stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that because it's something I've thought about actually, but I haven't fully figured that out, you could say. So I'd love to talk more about that. The last area I wanted to mention is some of you who are associated with schools may have heard of the MTSS. That's multi-tiered system of supports, right? Thank you. As I started that acronym, I thought, oh, why did I start this? But anyway, students who were in tier 3 of the MTSS who had either low grades or low attendance, some administrators and also some staff decided to reach out to students who were categorized in that way, you know, sought out their opinions on, hey, are we doing a good job with supporting you with these MTSS supports? Is this actually helping or not? And of course, that's not direct involvement in policy, but it is usually, it's more than what usually happens, you know, to students in terms of MTSS usage. And now I want to move on to some theories. A lot of times talks start with the theories, but I'm going to end with theories. First of all, I want to talk about intersectionality. So intersectionality the term was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar in the late 80s. And I see a lot of nods in the room. Maybe folks online are also nodding. This theory was proposed in order to understand the experiences of Black women with both racism and sexism and how the law was not taking into account that intersection. And since then, other folks have come in with talking about other forms of intersectionality, for instance, related to disability. That's the Anandasaka et al. Right there, and other areas of intersectionality. And I want to point out the intersectionality that this talk has pointed out. First, anti-Blackness and white supremacy are areas that shaped what you saw in the talk. This is related to race in general, but white supremacy is the societal context in which the school is situated. And then anti-Blackness is something that the Black students in that school were facing. And so they're shaping a lot of what we saw here. And then you'll see overlapping with that is age and adultism. So adultism is the ideology that adults inherently know better than youth. And you'll see that this overlap is indicating that youth of color may have had more barriers to leadership roles than white youth, which are not necessarily in the study. However, that's what this diagram can help us to see these intersections. Also, I want to turn to, on the other side of the diagram, disability. In other words, ableism in terms of the form of oppression. And you may or may not know research about how disability is racialized. I'm sure that you know a lot as a student in DPS department. Yeah. In other words, disability is racialized, and you can see that in disproportionate referrals to special education. In other words, over-referring some groups of students of color to special education when it's not needed. In other words, because of biases, because of educator biases. And so you can see there an intersection of disability and ableism in particular with racism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And then finally, I want to talk about the bottom circle, which is related to language or linguistic discrimination. There has been research about ratiolinguistics from Flores and Rosa, and other folks have looked at the ways that students who are labeled as English language learners are racialized and seen as students of color. And so you'll see how this circle is overlapping with the top circle. But also, of course, there are students who are labeled as English language learners who also have disabilities. And of course, all youth are youth. And so they're all facing adultism. And so there's a lot of intersection happening. But I also want to point out that this diagram doesn't include everything that we need to really include. It just includes these 4 areas that came up the most in the study. Now, what would have happened if myself and my colleagues had asked specifically about other forms, other axes of power dynamics? We would have heard a lot more, I think, about underrepresentation or overrepresentation in these leadership spaces. For instance, related to not just race and disability and age and language, but also citizenship status, sexuality, gender, religion, and social class, and more. And you'll see some more research cited at the bottom of the slide there. So these are some of the areas that a different study, I hope I can do this or we can do this, can look at more of these axes, because we can better see how students are being under or overrepresented in these leadership spaces. Now I want to close with some recommendations to address tokenization and inequitable representation. Specifically why, just going back to what I was talking about, it's to leverage the potential of authentic, inclusive youth leadership, because this has a lot of potential to create better policies that can address inequitable conditions. And so these are recommendations for adults. I'm assuming that those online are all adults, and I think that all of us in here are adults, even though we range in age. So related to tokenization, it's important for adults to reflect on their, or I should say our, motivations for youth voice initiatives. This gets back to some of our conversation at the beginning. Maybe sometimes one of the intersecting motivations is for a school to look good, or the district to look good, to look progressive, for instance, or maybe not, but it's up to the adults to reflect on their actual motivations. It'd be great if adults could co-construct the goals of a given initiative with youth, or if those goals are set, at least communicate these preset goals to the youth. And for everyone, for all adults, really professional development is needed. This is because youth are not often seen as valid co-decision makers. And also there are all these other biases that many adults have, perhaps most adults have, related to these various axes that we just talked about. And so there needs to be a space for adults to really learn about these types of biases related to youth, in particular youth of color and youth with disabilities, youth who are labeled as English language learners, and more. And to really reflect and be vulnerable about that, because it doesn't go away, but it requires continual reflection. Inequitable representation, it's necessary to consider that intersectionality that we were talking about. I'd say more than those 4 areas of this talk. I suggest looking at all types of different intersectionality and representation. Because, for instance, like I was just mentioning, there could be students who are labeled as English language learners who have disabilities. How is their representation in a given sphere? And other intersecting axes there. Also, I suggest doing what Sandoval School did, which was to remove policy restrictions on participation when possible. So for the grade level councils, they opened that up to anyone, and they didn't have a cap on the number of members. But removing policy restrictions, I would bet, is not going to solve the problem in and of itself. It requires proactive steps to address representation. But I want to end here by saying, keep in mind that this representation is just a step. Equal representation is not the same as equitable participation, as you can imagine, right? And so it's just the first step to get this equitable representation. And then the real goal is equitable participation, which is not the subject of this talk. The subject of this talk is the first step, equitable representation. So let's just return to what we saw earlier, that website and also the clip. So I didn't bring up these two school districts to malign them, badmouth them or anything. Both districts are actually doing more than a lot of districts are. The superintendent's student advisory council is not at every school district. It's actually very few school districts. And very few districts have a student board member. But if we're gonna have these positions, we might as well have them be useful, right? Might as well have them represent the students who we want to have represented, specifically the students who are facing the most injustice. How can we have these policies that forward this equitable and inclusive vision without centering the voices of those who are facing the most injustice? And so that's why these two districts have taken some good steps, but there's more to be done because the tokenization and the inequitable representation still need to be addressed here. And I also want to show some references. I have a lot of references. And I want to say thank you. Thanks so much for coming.
Questions? And if you're online, go ahead, you can put a question in the chat or the Q&A. Questions?
Yes.
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with the kind of following up to what was asked earlier about Zoom and stuff like that. It seems like you didn't ask about social class necessarily in this, but I was wondering if there were some comments that did come out around social class, especially around access to Zoom and the fact that it was available, especially the first year via Zoom, if that prevented people from being able to join or actually join in a way that could be more engaged in terms of like, you know, having the capacity to have both the camera on and the, you know, and sharing a screen and like that involves a lot of Wi-Fi power, computer power, et cetera. And so I was curious about that or how you think that might be involved and maybe even kind of perpetuating some issues moving along as GC is still on Zoom.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. And yes, it is an area I want to look more into. So this particular district that Sandoval School is housed in supplied laptops. They didn't get out immediately, but by fall of 2020, when the study was starting, everybody in the school had a laptop at their house and a hotspot. But the hotspots didn't work as fast as people who paid for their internet. It was slower. So I'm sure that was an issue. I'm sure. And in terms of social class, not related to the technology, but there were some comments about students who needed to work. Some students were actually working during the day, during their classes. As you can imagine, they had to go to work to support their families as people got sick, as family members got let go of jobs with COVID restrictions or cutbacks. And so some students were at work while they were also, you know, on their phone at school. And so anyone who was working after school, or like I said, sometimes having to work during school, wasn't able to participate in these after school, like the student advisory board was after school, as was the GC, the governance council. And I think that that's also something that was a major barrier. Also, I think space in the home, how much space was in the home, and the number of people in the home. Some students commented on that, like, you know, even during the school day, saying that it was really hard to find, you know, there's, you know, several students maybe in the same room, several children in the same room who are students in different schools, but all online, you know, together. And so it was hard to concentrate. And so, you know, after school and these extra spaces, or even in those in-class spaces, that was another barrier in that first school year. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
throughout your lecture, I kept reflecting back during my time as a teacher within TUSD, and I can't help but nod my head every single time, because I was a special education teacher, and then I segued into this elective class. It's like an in-school support, academic, career readiness type of class. And we were encouraged to have students take leadership positions in the school. However, the structural problems or, the inequities of the structure within schools and at the district level, state level, all the way up, it's kind of overwhelming to think of any impactful change that benefits student voice. So I have a overarching question, maybe. So what level do you think could be the most useful in making policy change regarding student voice? Eliminating those barriers. So would it be at a school site or a district level type of situation or state, or what is your opinion?
Oh, goodness. That's a tough one. And I actually would love to hear your opinion. I think that, I also get overwhelmed thinking about these mandated services, as Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Tefera in the department have pointed out in different research, and also others have pointed out in different research. Mandated services provide supports, and they also can do things like we saw in this presentation. They can also create separations, exclusion, in this case, from leadership. So I'm not going to touch the federal level. I do think, though, that districts and schools and states can make concrete steps. There are states that now require student input, but I think like the state of California just required this recently, maybe 2 years ago. It can easily be co-opted. So I honestly think that there's never a time when it's going to be, we got it set, but that we have to continue, or anyone who's interested in authentic youth voice that's representative, that we have to keep working constantly and just keep reflecting and pushing to make these more equitable. Because I think that these two issues are going to be continually coming up. These students who are seen as kind of like the overachievers, which is to quote one of the participants actually, and are going to be probably in these positions more often, or white students in a school that has a majority of white students, or white students will be overrepresented in any school where white students are, and whichever students make it to these positions are probably, the tendency would be for adults to tokenize them, because the youth are going to be in a position of less power in that position, in that situation. But I do think that it's worth continuing, I do think that the realizing, even though it might be not possible to completely realize the vision of youth facing the most injustices, contributing to policy, I think it's such a worthwhile vision, and it has such a powerful potential impact that it's worth continuing to push for it. The awesome thing, I'll just do a little tangent here, is that this school, they read a draft of this paper, right? And then they started to address this issue. And then students started creating Tabari, remember Tabari? That's the pseudonym. He and some other students started their own youth participatory action research project to look at underrepresentation. And since then, the school, as pushed by students, has tried to increase representation in these youth leadership roles. So I see some potential. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody online?
No questions online. Thank yous.
I got one more question. That's cool with everybody?
Yes.
Sorry, not to be a hog, but so how can we address adultism if we're in the trenches?
Yeah,
From school admin to our
Yeah.
colleagues to support staff to parents even.
yeah.
You know, how can we handle those conversations
Mm-hmm.
with both maybe adults and with students who are facing those problems?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Again, something for a long discussion and something I would love to hear everybody's opinions about, really. I would say that to always bring up the structural aspect of it, honestly, because these structures in a school or district are, students are positioned as those who are learning stuff. And the adults are positioned, most of the adults, or a lot of the adults are positioned as those who have the knowledge to impart to the students. And so there's inherently that issue. But I think bringing that up is going to be important, and also having adults who are engaged in this type of work to experiment with the physical space that they, for instance, meet with youth in. Let's say they experiment with not having it in their own classroom, but having it in another room in the school. Or let's say they experiment with having it in a place that's not even on the school campus. You know, what happens in those different spaces? And what happens when somebody who's not a teacher in that particular school comes in, an adult who's not a teacher in that particular school comes in? Or when a youth, a student from a different school comes in to help facilitate. So I think that there are ways to talk with adults about it and help adults to reflect on things that they can control, like these different spaces, and then reflect on, oh, was it different when we met here? Was it different when there was a youth from another school who was facilitating? I think that could help. Yeah. Oh, and one more thing is for me, with Dr. Tausea Gonzalez and Dr. Isabel Durand, we actually video recorded all of our YPAR meetings. Yeah, I know. And this, for me personally, I saw so many ways. I saw the many, many ways I was enacting adultism and other forms of oppression by watching these videos. And so if adults are able to video themselves in these spaces, working with youth, it might be helpful to further reflection.
Interesting insight. We do have a comment from someone in the chat, and then we are about time to end, but they say, in addition to the pieces mentioned, building empathy, adults need to build empathy for youth today. We all know what it was like to be a young person. None of us know what it's like to be a young person in 2024.
That's the truth. That is the truth. Thank you so much to the person who wrote that.
Yeah, and we have one, this is the last question. Is there research that has shown a school with very successful student involvement? And if so, what did they do? Could this serve as a role model for other schools?
That's a great question. There are some pieces of research about that, and that's actually what this study meant to do. I pointed out some of the ways that it didn't work as well, because I think that there are those roadblocks. And so even though the school was a model in many ways, there were some roadblocks to that. But there are also other studies out there, and I'm happy to share those with that person. Feel free to email if my email is maybe provided.
Sure.
Okay, yeah.
We are at time, so thank you so much for
Thank you.
lots
you.
of real thought-provoking conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you
I really
all for
appreciate
coming.
it.
Thank you for those of you who joined us online, and have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.